Thank you very much for inviting me here. This is amazing. I don't think I've ever done talks in an actual castle before. I mean, were you all aware that we were going to be in an actual castle? No, I thought it was like a pretend thing. You know, like you have Harewood Castle. It's not. It's a big house. In the UK, yeah. Anyway, I'm really pleased that Rannika has changed her mind and invited me to speak about the Candlelighter Supportive Care Research Centre, which started... No, she hasn't. No, I've been forced to come and talk about IPD meta-analysis. And I've added the and friends on here as well. Because I'm thinking, how many of you out there have already done a systematic review? Hands up. Okay, hands down. Thank you very much for that. How many of you out there have done a clinical trial? Okay, hands down. Excellent. How many of you out there have done an observational study of some nature? So we're getting a sort of a half hands up. How many of you out there have just walked backstage in the middle of... It's lovely you've made it. Just take him to the toilet twice or three times, it'll be fine. So, some of you will know about systematic reviews, some of you have done systematic reviews, some of you will have a vague idea what a systematic review is. A systematic review, obviously, is the easiest form of study to do because it's basically stealing other people's data and pretending that you've made a difference. We have, at the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination, a slightly better description of it where we claim that it is something more scientific, and this is the sort of the official description of one. The idea being that you go out into the world to collect together all of the information that has been published on our subject very specifically, draw it in, appraise it, work out its strengths and its weaknesses, and then do some form of synthesis, drawing it together in order to get to a conclusion. Now, in doing that, you should be following a path. That path should be reproducible by somebody else. Somebody else might do the same path and go, actually, I disagree with you, but they'll be able to see the spots that are disagreed with. Now, the question is, why should we do systematic reviews instead of actually doing real research? Well, when it comes to clinical stuff, this, I still think, is one of the best examples. This, the one before wasn't. This is a whole load of studies. They were all done 60s through the 90s, okay? I'm looking around to see how many people recognize, maybe not a massive recognition of what those studies are. Some people have done, excellent. All they've done, they're looking at the odds of something really bad happening. That line's meant to be on 1, which is the odds of 1, which is like 1 times as likely, so it's not a bad thing. And it's death. So we're looking at death. We're looking at something with increased odds of death. These are all these studies from the 60s down to the 90s. What might the thing be that we're looking at? Chemo. Give chemo, increase the risk of death. Good guess, but no. Any other guesses? Smoking. Smoking would fit with that quite well, wouldn't it? Yeah, people keep studying it because people keep doing it and it increases your risk of death, but no. Any more guesses? Getting cancer. Yes, this is a study about giving people cancer and seeing if they're more dead than those people you didn't. Not quite, but no, we're actually getting further away, yeah. It's to do with children. Yeah, fair. No. If there's more than 3 studies, it can't be paediatric. Yeah. Yep. So these are all the observational studies about sleeping position and cot death. Yeah. Those are all the studies. So most of the back to sleep work that came out about, having your baby alive but with a squashed head, all that stuff really came through in the 90s. Why the bloody hell did it take so long? It's not as if it's subtle, is it? Cancer, chemo, smoking being guesses about increased odds of death. This is pre an era of systematic reviewing, and it's actually in the early 90s that a systematic review takes this on. And if instead of doing it study by study, what you do is you take each study and you add it so that you're adding up the total sum of human knowledge as you go along, then you get this. Each study adds to the ones before. So essentially what you've got is the diamond at the bottom of the forest plot, that's a meta-analytic diamond. What you're seeing here is that diamond going down and down and down. And if you do that, then there's really no question, is there, from the late 70s going onwards, that it's not something to keep studying this. Something to act on. So if we don't do systematic reviews, if we don't look at the totality of the evidence, if we do just look at individual studies and whinge about bits of individual studies, then maybe we miss the point and we end up leading to an estimate of, in each of those decades, getting on for a Boeing 747 jet's worth of babies that died of sudden death syndrome that could have been alive if they had been put down to sleep differently. This is just to cheer you up again afterwards. This is a cat. If you're really, really badly allergic to cats, it may not have the right effect. But they are safer on the internet. It's also because systematic review and meta-analysis goes into quite a lot of detail when it comes to maths. Okay? Yeah, I can see there's mild tachycardias occurring in certain places. If that happens, close your eyes, remember the cat. Close your eyes, remember the cat. Okay. So, what have we got when we're talking about systematic review and meta-analysis? So, I'm going to leave the cat up there. Because what we've got is a whole set of nested ideas here. Systematic review is, broadly speaking, the idea that you have a very specific question. And you go out into the world to find an answer to that question. And the question can often be phrased around, in this patient group, does this intervention compared to that intervention reduce the number of dead people? That sort of thing. In people turning up with febrile neutropenia, does the time to antibiotics actually make a difference to the number that are in ICU or have died? Those sorts of very specific questions. You go out into the world and you get all of the studies that have tried to answer that question. What you might do is have a basic quality bar there. So you might say, for interventional studies, we're going to look at randomized trials. In paediatrics, if you get more than 3, your question's too broad. You might say, I'm only going to take prospectively collected data. You might say, I'll take retrospectively collected data, but I won't take anything with fewer than 10 cases in it. You might say, I'm only going to get published data. You would be wrong if you did that. And I will give you an example in a moment. But you put basic quality bar in. And then you go, okay, of all these ones that seem to be aligned with our question, what is the actual quality of them? What is the risk of bias? What is the chance that that study is telling me a load of garbage? And you sort of rank that in terms of, this is very likely to be garbage. It's not really standing by you two for any particular reason. Honestly, it's not very likely to be garbage. Less likely to be garbage. Really, really unlikely to be garbage. Now, a lot of systematic reviews go, okay, we've done that, tick. But what you should do is when you're doing that next bit of synthesizing, bringing the information together, you should go, hang on, what if we do this and ignore the really garbage studies? Are we getting qualitatively the same answer? Quantitatively, it's got to be different because you've changed the numbers involved, yeah? But are we getting the same answer? Are we getting a really quite different answer? Because if we're getting a really different answer when we look at the higher quality studies, then maybe we shouldn't believe the add it all up stuff. Because whilst it might be mathematically more precise, it could be wrong. So you should be using that risk of bias in interpreting the information that you've got. And that drawing together should incorporate that. Now, you might see people of... Yeah.
How do you decide what is a quality study?
How do you decide what the quality is for the tape or recording? Very good question. So, there's a whole field of getting people PhDs and keeping them employed in meta-research. So research upon research. And so there's been an awful lot of stuff done to try to work out what are the features of various study designs that make it more or less likely to be biased. These are drawn down, and you can see them quite easily when you look at one of the reporting standards. So if you look at the Consort reporting standard, or you look at the Prisma reporting standards, or things like that, they've sort of crystallized some of the key points. And they get then translated into these risk of bias measures. And the way that they tend to be validated is by they take an awful lot of studies, often with one or two really, really big ones, and then look to see which studies were way off the real answer and what were the features of those. So you won't be surprised to find that in lots of things it's randomization for interventions, it's allocation concealment, it's about having inadequate or different follow-up between the two arms. For diagnostic studies, where people have gone, oh, well, the test we're testing says you've got it, so we don't need to do the other test to make sure you really have got it or not. That sort of confirmational bias, or the biases of the person who's reading the X-ray already knows the results of the histology, and suddenly they're able to say that it's definitely a rhabdomyosarcoma, that sort of thing. So there are those elements, and you can get those sheets and get those works things to do to check those out. And whilst we have tried in systematic review over the years to come up with a quantitative measure so that you can say, well, this one is going to be like 5% biased, this one is going to be 45% biased. Garbage. There are multiple PhDs showing how scoring them really, really doesn't help. It's a broad band that you've got. And they are risk of bias. Just because you think it's dodgy doesn't mean it's definitely dodgy, yeah? They could have pulled the rabbit out of the bag and actually done something valid and accurate, but you're just a bit sus, yeah? Again, not really trying to lay any blame at all when we look at the studies later. I thought, it's the 3rd out of 3, I might as well try. I've been holding back for the last, no. So you should be using that risk of bias when you're looking at the studies and pulling them all together. Now, when we're doing this, I said, I think I've got the slide right. I've been up to too early in the morning to tell. Yeah, we should not say publication is a good reason to include something. Now, some of you may have tried to submit something to a journal. Has anybody tried to submit any? Yes, okay, all right, good. Have you ever been accepted first time round with no changes? Okay, big show off. That's about the right percentage, I think. Somewhere around 1%. It's easier to be the unconvicted assassin of a president than it is to get in first time with no corrections on a real piece of work rather than something that's actually been commissioned. And the editors are sat there waiting for the issue to go out going, oh, bloody hell, I really hope they submit it by the deadline because we've got to go to print. And that was a genuine impression of what editors do at times. So that act of being rejected, which may have happened to you in your personal lives, I am not asking here if that is the case with any of you. That act of being rejected and then going to a different journal and getting it in, have you fundamentally changed the science of your papers or your clinical studies in particular to get it into the next journal? Maybe not the experimentally, I can torture some cells ones, but I've poured a load of stuff into children or I've collected the notes. Has the science changed? Largely not, no. No, largely what you've done is you've gone down the hill of impact factor / quality / what they will tolerate and believe. Publication in a top factor journal, therefore, might tell you that either you're sleeping with one of the editors or you've managed to write it incredibly beautifully, or it fits with the politics that they want to hear at that point in time, for some journals in particular. It is not an indicator of quality. As I might have mentioned last year, the MMR paper did get published in The Lancet, which used to be considered a decent medical journal. So if you take the view that some people just can't be asked keeping going down the hill of sending in, getting rejected, sending in, getting rejected, sending in, getting rejected, going on holiday and forgetting I ever did it, then you end up with some studies that are out there in the world that have never been published. So the idea is, this is a pretend example, big studies at the top, little studies at the bottom. All of these are the studies that exist in the world. The dotted line is the true measure of effect. It works, it reduces death, but by a little tiny bit. But what if the people who did the black studies, the darker studies, did not keep on going because they have a null effect, or because they're little studies and they keep getting rejected saying, well, you've shown this thing doesn't work, but your study's really too small to tell us that. What if, and it doesn't happen so much now, the pharma company went, tell you what, why don't you write up this instead? Then the universe of studies that you can find looks like this. If you add those up, you get the wrong measure of effect. You exaggerate its effect. So you should never have "and was published" as one of your criteria. You can actually see this. The reason it's called a funnel plot is because if you imagine this upside down, it's like a funnel that you might pour things into, yeah? And that is a very artistic funnel that you might pay an awful lot of money for from an artisan glass blower, but it's not actually going to be any good, yeah? We can hardly ever look at this in paediatrics because you really need more than 10 studies. And as Krista pointed out, more than 3 studies, it's not paediatrics. The other thing that we do a fair bit in systematic review, and this is where we're getting into why IPD meta-analysis might be better, is we look at subgroups. So this is a fairly classic sort of subgroup analysis where you're looking at an overall treatment. This is the treatment of steroids in bacterial septic shock in grown-ups, low dose, long course, short course, high dose steroids. There's looking to see, is there a difference? You could ask the question, do steroids make a difference? But then you could say, be more subtle about it. Actually, what steroid, what dose, what time frame? Those things might matter. And you can look at them and do different subgroups. So you can look in one subgroup versus another. And that's what they've done here, showing that there's a hint that this lower dose replacement is better than the going in with a big slam. This was the sort of work that was being done at that time. The reason I kept using this is because it's a really good example to me of, well, why are they doing subgroups? Why aren't they asking one question in its first place? Because they were never going to add all this together, were they? It doesn't make any sense to add them all together in the first place, because steroid isn't a thing. You've got to give it in a certain amount of a certain time period. And what you've got here is a measure of heterogeneity being mixed upness. Now this has got an I-squared of 15%, suggesting it's not very mixed up. This has got an I-squared of 68%. It's probably difficult to spot at this distance, actually, saying that it's very mixed up. Now, if you were to look at those, would you say one was strikingly more heterogeneous, mixed up than the other in those groups? It's not. Yeah, exactly. Staring at it with intensity, because it doesn't really. So sometimes statistics are a bit rubbish. There are subtle things about statistics that you shouldn't always believe. So when somebody says the I-squared is over 50%, that means it's highly heterogeneous. It isn't true. I mean, it is in paediatrics because we have small studies, but it isn't necessarily true, because it's to do with the number of studies you've got in total as well. Now, if you were going to do subgroups, you might want to do it because you want to say, is there a difference when we look at the effects across something that changes between the studies? And this is where we're now getting into statistics properly. Regression analysis. We're happy with regression. How big is the shoe size? How tall is the person likely to be? Type thing. Yep. So, meta-regression is regression, but you're taking a more philosophical approach. No. It's regression across studies. So what we're looking at here is the effectiveness of aspirin doses in trying to stop grown-ups having a stroke. Or if they've had one stroke, stopping them having another stroke. It's that sort of thing, yeah? And we've got little doses of aspirin to big doses of aspirin. Each of the circles is an individual study, and the size of the circle reflects the size of the study. Which in some ways is quite unhelpful, isn't it? Because the little tiny studies are a little tiny circle, whereas actually they're really quite uncertain, so you'd quite like them to be bigger in somehow than little and tiny and implying precision. So there's something about this particular graphical display that isn't very good, but statisticians can sometimes be difficult to talk to in ways that helps them understand the points of view of other people. Not all statisticians, he says, backing off quickly, but sometimes it can be difficult. Anyway, this is how they do it, so that's what we're saying. You can see here, there's very little relationship between the two. Sort of, the more aspirin you give, the more dead people you get. And that might not be because they're having strokes, it might be because they've already bled out before they can have one. But it isn't an enormous difference. It's a fairly flat line. Note, the aspirin dose is determined by the study. It's not a patient characteristic. It's a characteristic of the study, randomizing the doses. Yeah? That's probably okay. But if you get into the realms of looking at patient-level characteristics and do a meta-regression on that, you run the risk of getting the wrong result. So this is a theoretical example, and I follow it up with a real one. So say we've got something where we're looking at the effect reducing, so with the same sort of idea, lower down, better effect, higher up, worse effect, age, increasing age over the length there. Looks like there's a relationship between average age in the study and the amount of effect. The older the people, the studies done in the older people, worse than the studies done in the younger people. Plot a regression line through it. If this was true, you could look at each individual study and go, okay, so can you see a relationship between age and effectiveness within the individual study? Yep. And you would expect it to look like that, the same sort of relationship in each individual study. But it might really, really be that what you see is no relationship between age and effect in each individual study. And instead, what you're looking at is something else. So you might be looking at the earliest studies done in the field in the old people where they used the wrong dose. It could be that they used a less intensive intervention. And as the intervention got more and more intensive when they were doing it with younger and younger people. It could be something fundamentally different between the studies rather than a feature of that patient-level characteristic. And this is absolutely seen when you do things and you look to see how well do blood pressure medicines work, and is that related to whether you're male or female? Self-reported sex. This shows very little difference in each individual study, but you plot it out overall and you find it makes a difference. Now, why is it that those studies with a really high proportion of men in them showed very little effect? Is it because they just didn't take the bloody tablets? Is it because they got the diagnosis wrong or they didn't come up? Who knows? But you've got the wrong conclusion if you do a meta-regression on a patient-level effect. But if you had the individual data from each study, then you would be able to see, is there an effect of age or not? And you could do that in two ways, which leads to a really important thing about individual participant data meta-analysis. It's a sort of subset of systematic reviewing with a slightly different spin. What do we do in IPD meta-analysis? We've still got the very, very focused question. We've still got the need to appraise the data that you get. How well was the study conducted? What is it that we're looking at? What are the definitions involved? We've still got a need to do some sort of synthesis, drawing things together. But the conceit that in systematic review we are going to get all of the studies in the world is dropped. We go, we're going to use the most data we can get our hands on. We're going to hope that those are the biggest studies and so most representative, but we are not going to cry if we miss some data from small studies. So there's a slight difference between them. And then when you're doing an IPD meta-analysis, you can take two approaches, broadly speaking. There's millions, but they fall into two main camps. The first is, we're going to do standard style meta-analysis. We're going to get the results of each study, and we're going to plonk them down, and then we're going to add them all up. That is called a two-stage process, because there's two stages. You see, statisticians sometimes really, really clear when they're describing stuff. Two-stage process. Or you can do a one-stage process, which is where you get everybody on stage at the same time and get them to wave in one direction. No, it's not. Where you take all of the data and you put it into one massive pot. Each bit of data is tagged with which study it comes from, but you put it in one massive pot and you do a big, big, big type of regression analysis looking at all of it. Now, the benefit of that is that that's the way you can look at individual patient characteristics across these things. You could also do a regression on each single study and then add them together. But you can look to see, do individual patient characteristics actually modify the effect or modify the predictor or stuff like that? So you've got a much stronger way of not just telling, does this thing work, but are there groups of people in whom it works better or whom it works worse? So you can get some idea about should we be spinning this down to one particular group or another. The challenge with doing this, I thought that was the next slide, I'm just checking. The challenge with doing this is the practical difficulty of doing it. So for example, you've all done some sort of observational study near us, damn it, here, haven't you? Even if it's a sort of half request. You've all done something like this. What if I was to email you and say, doing an IPD meta-analysis on that observational stuff that you did, can I just have your data sheet, please, so that I can put it into this IPD meta-analysis? What would your instinctive response be? Of course. Oh! They're just going to go away and make sure the data is actually valid rather than the stuff they normally put out. But yeah, some people, really quick, yes, of course I will share the data with you. Other people, not a hope in hell. It's mine, I did the work, you're not having it. The English Channel divides. I'm sorry, has that gone through the Brexit regulations? There are a range of differences in response that you get. We've noted that if you write as a relatively junior, unknown researcher in the field, it seems that you don't often get a positive response. We're actually doing a randomized study to see if this is true or not. So we're doing some data pleading where we're randomizing between the person that's actually doing the work, the researcher, the well-known professor in the field who is doing bugger all apart from claiming they're allowed to send it from their email address, and the ultimate in guilt, a parent association person, in this case, whose child died of the condition, writing exactly, that is what we are going for. That level of agonizing guilt on the part of the researcher is exactly what we're hoping to leverage to get more data out of them. Is it ethical? We didn't ask. They do it on charity adverts. It's that the parents wanted to do it. Because we were whinging about the fact the researchers didn't, and they went, I bet they'd answer if I wrote to them. It's great working for people with Sheffield. So we're trying to see if that's the case. But why, and that's why you're like, are we missing things? Why have we not got data from some places, not from other places and so on? So we're trying to get the IPD back. That's one of the really big challenges in IPD meta-analysis, is actually getting hold of it. Then you've got the challenge of it arriving. You do the analysis on it. You look at the paper that was published. Yes, exactly that. That and that don't entirely match in sometimes quite interesting ways that mean somebody must have accidentally dropped a few lines of code or So in IPD land, we talk about that as the benefit of having the raw data because we can make sure that it's up to date and really precise, rather than you're a bunch of cheating cheats that have said something wrong to the journal that you sent it to in the first place. Although sometimes it's so far off the truth, and this has happened in some adult meta-analyses that a colleague was involved with, they've had to go to the university and say, hang on, these two things don't match. They really, really don't match. And things like, this is a randomized study. Oh, patient 1 got treatment A, patient 2 got treatment B. Patient 3 got treatment A, patient 4 got treatment B. Patient 5 got treatment A. That's an amazing randomization that's managed to alternate for 463 cases. Well, it was random when they came in next, was actually the reason given on one of the studies. Admittedly, it was only 70 cases long, but even so, just a fundamental misunderstanding of what that word means. So you get the benefit of having much cleaner data to work with when you're doing IPD in some senses. And some places will actually update the data. So you will get the updated stuff if you're looking at survival curves. But it's massively more labour intensive and massively, massively longer. A systematic review you can reasonably turn around in about 6 months, even a good quality one, maybe a year if you're stretching it out. An IPD meta-analysis is going to take you 2 years, near as damn it, unless you've got everybody absolutely poised to get that data in the first place. But it allows you to do an awful lot more subtle things. But is there any benefit of doing it? Yes, sorry.
How do you encounter all different sets of biases from the different study? Because what is it? Yeah. Everyone interprets it in their way, but then you add bias to bias to bias to bias.
Yeah, so IPD meta-analysis is just like a beautiful pastry of many layers of bias, all topped on the top of each other. How are we going to deal with this? Sort of, yeah. So some of those biases will be in the way that they recorded the information, which would be the same as if you'd taken it from the paper in the first place. IPD, you often get a clearer idea about what did they actually measure and how did they actually code it. So sometimes you can get around the bias almost in a bit less than that. Sometimes you've got different categorizations. So they might have said that was severe, and another thing says, well, no, this is severe. If you're really lucky, and most data sets are actually collected this way, they're not collected categorized. They get collected as, say, the blood pressure and the heart rate and the oxygen saturations, and then it gets categorized as severe illness or not severe illness. And IPD can actually allow you to disentangle those different definitions that sit between places and actually give a unified sort of idea of this is the definition we're using on this study, or if we use this definition, then we can use this one instead. So what about the problems of information dropping off as you go through? I mean, in a sense, it's similar in that it would be there in the first place. And you can also do, in IPD, you can do some stuff on missing data and how missing it is. So we'll definitely touch on that in a second. But is there any point in doing it? Well, this was a large study looking at a whole load of IPD meta-analyses that had been done after a standard aggregate meta-analysis, where you take it sort of from the literature and add it all up. The cluster of them sits up there in the IPD significant, the AD, which is the aggregate data non-significant thing. It was worthwhile because it increased the power, because you could do a more precise measurement and you could get a better answer out. Sometimes it flips the other way and says, actually, when we look at this in more detail, you do not get that. Sometimes they're identical and you feel like you've wasted vast years of your time, effort, sweat, bribes that you could have used for something else instead, and you've come up with essentially the same answer. Those are even more disappointing because then no bugger wants to publish it either. Is there a point? Yes, yeah. So there is a point. And then if you look specifically in cancers, this is looking at some big stuff that was done around adult cancer treatments, the difference between IPD and aggregate data meta-analysis. Now, you could read this. These are adult cancers and epilepsy. Epilepsy is the children's one on here. You could look at this and say, well, you don't need to do it for children because essentially children's authors and are honest. They actually tell you the truth. Whereas gynecologists lie, respiratory physicians, broadly speaking, lie, breast surgeons, they over-exaggerate what they think they're doing. Bowel surgeons the same, and the cardiologists, because they are heartless, absolutely correct all the time, smack bang on the nose. That is not a safe interpretation to give in a mixed audience, by the way. One of the benefits of IPD meta-analysis, honestly, it's not just about the significance values. One of the benefits is it allows you to see variability between studies in a way that's a lot more powerful than looking at what a study does altogether. And you might actually do this if you want to look within centres, within a multi-centre study that you're doing. it can be quite unnerving. Now, this data is IPD that's been collected looking at the proportion of patients that are eligible to go home with low-risk febrile neutropenia across the course of the UK in a number of different units. PTCs are our major treatment centres. POSCUs are our district hospitals that deal with the sort of side effect type thing but don't give chemo. That's the sort of the numbers on the bottom. This one, bigger is more. Again, same sort of idea, bigger ones, heavier, maybe a bit more precise in their estimates. What have we got here? We've got variation across size as we're going through here, but we're also getting unexplained variation, explained variation with outside the realms of chance if everybody was dealing with the same thing all the time. Why is it that POSCU number 5, 1 and 3 don't send anybody home? Well, it could be that POSCU 3 only actually put 2 patients in and both of them were horribly sick. You know, there could be that sort of explanation. But with this sort of data, with IPD data, rather than just going, these units are out with, you can actually start to come up with some hypotheses and go, why is it that this is happening? How can it be that these things occur? And you can do, and you should be doing your analysis in that sort of one-stage model of going, this data comes from this unit. Maybe it comes from this patient and this episode within this patient. And you can do models. Models not in the sense of things that you want to hang off your ceiling because you've painted them beautifully and they're made of plastic. Mathematical models that take into account the way that these things are clustered. And they can give you an estimate of how variable would the same patient be, sort of, if they'd landed in Dundee versus going to Basel versus being treated in Lyon, if we had the data to say it. Now, often that's more powerful when it comes back with there isn't much variation between centres, because if there is variation between centres, you then got to say why. And it's rare that you have collected enough data or the correct data to really try and explain those sorts of differences. You'll have your patient level differences, but then if you're seeing things outside of that, why is that happening? That's actually one of the areas where sometimes doing primary qualitative research can be interesting and go into different places to work out how they do things differently and then say, why is it that one place has maybe, if you're taking it in clinical trials, only got a 15% conversion rate from being offered to saying yes to randomization, and another place has got a 95% conversion rate from offering to randomization. So you can use that sometimes to go on and do other studies as well. But you can look at this variation between and actually try and drive in on it. I've realized there's no clock in this room. I've got 10 minutes. Yeah, I'll keep going. Good, because this is where it gets really, really, really interesting. Also, happy Pride. Febrile neutropenia is clearly the most important thing in all of our jobs and lives at all times and in all places. It could be that somebody in this room is finally going to answer the question that if you give antibiotics at 59 minutes, the child will live. And if you give antibiotics at 61 minutes, the child will die. And that's really, really important. Somebody in this room might come back with an answer to that in the very near future, I hope. Febrile neutropenia risk stratification. We did quite a lot of work on this to try and come up with why, and we did it with an individual participant data meta-analysis. Now, this is the sort of model that gets used. It says, I'm going to estimate the probability of a serious infection, and that's going to start with a baseline, and it's going to get wibbled up and down by a variety of things. So, for instance, you've got a kid, you come in, you know that your unit overall has a, roughly speaking, 20% risk of the kid actually having a bacteremia. Okay, the kid's got AML. Is the risk higher or lower in your minds? Higher, higher. Kid's got AML, the risk got higher. The neutrophil count, you're one of these old-fashioned units that uses 1 as a cutoff. The neutrophil count is 0.98. Is the risk going higher or lower? Or staying the same? Same. Maybe a bit lower. What if the temperature that brought them in was exactly 38 once? What if it was 39.5? Individual factors wibbling up and down. And there's an awful lot of, oh my God, I don't actually know what the answer is, faces in the audience. Isn't it amazing? We do this all the time. But actually, do we really know what the data says? No, we don't. Why? Because mostly it doesn't matter, because the only thing that matters on the wards is have you followed the rule or not the reality of the situation, like many things in life. Anyway, we created this model using 5,000 episodes of data from loads and loads of different places, and that came through with it, and it was really, really, that's a really badly presenting slide. Anyway, well, I'll skip back to this one now. What it came back with was the things that matter. Does the kid look really, really unwell? What's the total white count? What's the monocyte count within that? What's the tumour type that they've got in the first place? And then we went out into the world and we said, and is this true if we take this new model to a different set of data? We came up with all sorts of questions. If you're doing a prediction in a different centre, do you know what your baseline rate is? Your alpha, the starting point before you do the wibbles. Do the wibbles, are they the same in all the different centres? Or does that matter as to how you take your temperature, for example? Or how far away it is that that child took the temperature before they came in? Does it matter if you're the sort of centre that does an awful lot of transfusing of platelets? If so, does platelets lose their ability to give you any predictive feature? Or do they flip and end up patients that come in with really high platelets are the ones with the problem, because they're the ones that were transfused the day before, and they've come in with a raging line infection because you just did that to them. So there's all sorts of sort of subtle things, and you look at it in the data and then you go, oh God. And then you've got to try and explain it backwards. IPD meta-analysis also powers the most interesting form of meta-analysis in the world, and that is shopping basket meta-analysis, also known as network meta-analysis. Does everyone know about Aldi? Has everyone heard of Waitrose? Some people have. Waitrose. Waitrose is the sort of place that very, very well-spoken people shop in. They have three sorts of avocado. Samphire is routine. Tesco's normal place for normal people. If you were to take a traditional meta-analysis approach, and you met somebody that had shopped in Tesco and shopped in Aldi, and went, which one's cheaper? And they went, Aldi. You'd go, Aldi is cheaper than Tesco. You then meet somebody that has shopped in Waitrose and shopped in Tesco. And you ask them, do you know which one was cheaper? And they'll turn to the maid and go, answer the creature. And they'll go, Tesco. And then your traditional meta-analyst will go, Waitrose is more expensive than Tesco. Aldi is cheaper than Tesco. We cannot tell you if Waitrose is more or less expensive than Aldi, because we have no comparison between the two. And this is likely to be true, because the people who shop in Waitrose are unlikely to shop in Aldi most of the time. It's clearly garbage, isn't it? So, meta-analysis have come up with a way of doing this network meta-analysis. Febrile neutropenia, most important thing in the world. This is a whole load of empiric antibiotic therapies grouped together, roughly speaking, not by their individual brand name. Each line tells you the trials that directly compared them head-to-head, includes adult and children, and the thickness of the line is the number of trials. So a thicker line is more trials. Yeah? There are comparisons that don't exist there. But what you can do is you can draw in those lines because you know about the other shopping baskets, essentially. And there are fancy mathematical ways of doing that. And what that can do is not just give you the exact estimate per time, But it can come up with this, the probability of being the best agent. And looking at the randomized trials of giving these agents empirically in febrile neutropenia shows that single agent tazobactam is the most likely to have the least number of dead people, all causes. If you put an aminoglycoside on, Taz and Gent, you drop the chance and you increase the chance, I know, you increase the chance of people being dead by adding in an aminoglycoside. Now, when I did this analysis, I thought I'd put it in wrong. Because I could not, for the life of me, think, I must have put this in wrong. I must have put this in wrong. So I got someone else to check it because I didn't trust myself. No. More dead people if you use empiric, frontline, for everyone, aminoglycosides in the settings where you could reasonably do a randomization that didn't have it up front. So if you've got the sort of dirty, mucky, horrible, antimicrobial resistant soup of somewhere like London, you should always shower after you leave London, preferably in a bleach diluted substance. If anyone's blown their nose when they've left London, it's horrible, horrible. Somewhere like that, maybe not. Somewhere beautiful and clean, like God's own county, Yorkshire, with the rolling hills, the amazing tea, the fantastic gins, the constant rain. There you can get away with it. And you can have fewer dead people by using less and fewer resistance. So you can get these things coming through. IPD, if you've got it, increases the power of this even more, because you can look at subtle differences between studies. You can analyse 4 different studies. And, hopefully, you can do this. This is a small child on a vomit machine. But they seem to be enjoying themselves. I will take it off now before we actually throw up. Knowing that children enjoy that, why do we go to the adult literature on antiemetics and go, oh, they're going to work the same? Kids and vomit. But fancy maths to the rescue. That sort of idea of the shopping baskets thing can come into play when you're looking at how do you take the information from adult studies and draw them into the children's studies. This is that sort of network meta-analysis map in this one. Instead of being thickness of lines, it's number of lines that are linking together the different antiemetic combinations that have been tried in children. We could strengthen these lines. We could make it all so much bigger if we could draw in the adult evidence in a sensible way. Doing that with published data is almost impossible. You really, really, really need to use IPD to do that. And so another value of IPD is to come up with that. Now that tells us what's existed in the past, but it might also give us hints for the future. So for example, if the relationship between adult and children studies in antiemetics is roughly the same across multiple classes of antibiotics, across multiple eras, across multiple metagenicities, then when we come up with something new, we can start from a fairly reasonable position that isn't, we know nothing about these at all, but instead, we know this because we've done it in adults, and we know that the relationship between those is about this. So this is our starting place. And that's a whole branch of cheaty statistics known as Bayesian. It's got a lot of philosophy behind it, mostly around the racetrack. But that's another way that we can do it in order to maximize the value of the information that we already exist. The power of IPD making that work. I think I'm not going to put that slide up next because of the fact that it's going to make you all throw up again. And I'll leave it on there and say if there's any questions, then I will be drinking later. Feel free to ask me during that or at some other time when Ronica says.